Andy, one episode from 2012 that made a lasting impact on our audience was the 6 questions every leader should ask.
Oh, yeah.
We discussed the value of asking questions to understand the why behind the what, and how essential it is for leaders to be learners. It's a topic that never gets old. Run through those 6 questions from that episode.
Yeah, and specifically, these were questions that we challenged leaders to ask about their organization. And as we prepared for today's podcast, Lane, these were kind of convicting. I may need to go back and listen to this entire podcast because, again, we get busy. We're going on to the next thing. But these 6 questions, they never get old. They do not have a shelf life. So here they are real quick. And they're uncomfortable. So here we go. Number 1 was, who needs to be sitting at the table? In other words, do we have the right people around the table to make the decisions we're making? And are we enslaved to our org chart?
Oh, yeah.
And are we willing to ignore the org chart in order to get the right people around the table? That's awkward. Number 2 is, where are we manufacturing energy? We learned that language from our friend Reggie Campbell years and years ago. He'd say, I think that's sideways energy. I think that's sideways energy. So second question is, where are we manufacturing energy? Where are we trying to create energy around something that we don't really have energy around, whether it's a product, an idea? So that's number 2. And then the third one is a personal question. Where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization? Every leader should ask this. In fact, everybody and every organization should ask this question. Where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization? Because the quicker I can move myself into a position where I'm spending more of my time on the area or in the area where I make the greatest contribution, I'm going to be more successful. So where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization? Number 4, we all hate this one. Who is not keeping up?
Yeah.
Who is not keeping up? As you look around, as you, again, look at the people you're working with or the people that report to them, who's not keeping up? And Lane, we've been doing this for coming up on 28 years.
Yeah.
And we've had some difficult conversations with staff through the years. They weren't doing anything wrong. They just weren't keeping up, and it was holding their team back. So who's not keeping up? The next question was, what have we fallen in love with that's no longer the best way to fill in the blank? What have we fallen in love with that's no longer the best way to whatever that was designed to do? And we talked about those old couches that we move around from house to house.
Yep.
That everybody else knows they're ugly. We don't, because we've gotten used to them. And again, 28 or so years into this, the temptation for us, this is why it's such a relevant question. The longer anyone is in an organization, the older the organization, there's always going to be the temptation to carry things along that really aren't as effective as they used to be. But it's just how we do it here. It's what we do. It's what made us famous.
Right.
We talked a little bit during that one about that amazing conversation that Andy Grove asked when the Japanese were making computer chips cheaper and quicker. And he asked that wonderful question. It sits on my credenza to this day, since we talked about it all those years ago. He said, what if the board kicked us out and brought in a new group? What would they do?
And what should keep us from going out the door walking?
Yeah, he said, well, why don't we? We walked right in his, I think it was the president of the company of Intel at the time said, well, I think the new group would get us out of chip manufacturing. And he said, why don't we walk out the door, come back in and do it ourselves? So what have we fallen in love with that's no longer the best way to? And then the last question is, what would a great leader do? As we face any decision, any dilemma, okay, what would a great leader do? Great meaning not self-serving what's best for the organization, what's best for the people in the organization, what's best for the customer, even if it costs me, even if it undermines my own ambition, what would a great leader do? So who needs to be sitting at the table? Where are we manufacturing energy? Where do I make the greatest contribution to the organization? Who is not keeping up? What have we fallen in love with that's no longer the best way to? And what would a great leader do?
Andy, it's fascinating to me how those questions continue to be relevant even after all these years.
Yep.
Looking back, would you make any changes to them now?
Well, actually, I thought about that, and I certainly wouldn't take any of those off the list. There's always other questions you can add, but that goes on and on and on. But honestly, preparing for today and even now reading through those, every time I look at that list, I always feel like I've got some homework to do. So no, I wouldn't make any changes. Those questions have definitely stood the test of time.
Another recurring theme over the years is challenging the status quo. We all know that change can be tough, especially when it comes to organizational systems.
Yep.
In one of our conversations, I think from 2016, you emphasized the importance of leaders challenging established processes. For this one, I'd like for us to go back and actually listen to a clip from that podcast.
All right.
Well, to that point, Andy, I remember you reading a statement from the book that you said actually scared you as a leader.
Absolutely, and I know exactly what you're talking about. This is a statement that I go back to over and over and over. In fact, when I pull out old teaching outlines from leadership talks, this statement shows up just about everywhere, whether I quote it or not. And it really did. It was inspiring in the early days, and now it does scare me a bit. So here's what they write. They say, leaders must challenge the process precisely because any system will unconsciously conspire to maintain the status quo and prevent change. I want to read that again.
Yeah.
Leaders must challenge the process. So in other words, this is the mandate. We must challenge the process. Why? Precisely because any system, even good systems, any system will unconsciously, and again, a system isn't even a living, breathing organism, but systems have power in organizational life. Any system will unconsciously conspire to maintain the status quo, and then here's the kicker, and prevent change. So again, if we're not careful, we wake up in an organization that is conspiring against us. Because every organization, whether it's industry-based, product-based, whatever it might be, every organization, the systems kind of basically determine job descriptions, they determine what people do. And if we're not careful, the system, in our case, that we created, conspires. That's a powerful word.
Yeah.
Conspires against us. And again, there are people listening today who feel like they have to go to work and work around the organization.
Yeah.
They feel like the organization is in the way of them doing what they were hired to do. Well, that's because there are things that haven't been challenged in a while, and the status quo gets in the way. So an organization or the systems in an organization unconsciously, because again, they're not living, breathing organisms. They're just the habits of an organization. They're the way an organization is established, or even the physical layout of an organization conspires to maintain the status quo and prevent change. Organizations do what organizations are organized to do. And if there is not periodic sort of whacking the hornet's nest a bit, things just don't change, and organizations resist change.
Once again, that certainly stands the test of time. That was from the book, The Leadership Challenge. And The Leadership Challenge was the very first leadership book I ever read. Boyd Bailey. Boyd Bailey purchased that book for me. I still have my original copy. And that statement truly calls us back to center and really to one of our primary responsibilities as organizational leaders, to challenge the process. And on that podcast, Tulane, you'll remember, we asked the question, okay, you can challenge the process to the point to where there's no more processes, because there are people that just want to change things for the sake of change. So that was a really, really rich conversation. But what it highlights for me, again, listening to it again after all these years, even though that statement really does, as I said, it shows up in organizational and leadership outlines constantly for me. It just reminds me that as the point leader for our organization, or for anyone listening who's a point leader for a department or division or whatever, we cannot allow ourselves to be managed into sameness to the point where we lose the discipline of challenging the process. And this is one of those tensions that we have to manage, which is another leadership podcast in the past. It's the tension of we have to have systems, and managers, great managers, and I'm surrounded by great managers, manage the systems and keep them in place. This is how we do it here. This is how we do it here. This is how we do it here. But at some point, this is how we do it here becomes a rut. So it's that delicate dance of always feeling permission to appropriately question pretty much everything, but not questioning it to the point where people begin to question whether or not they're doing the right thing.
Right.
Again, it is, as the quote says, it is as if our organizations are a living, breathing thing, and they do conspire against us. And we say this all the time on our podcast, that organizations do what they are organized to do. And this is why some of the leaders, you get up and you have these meetings and you cast vision and you got PowerPoint and all the stuff, and everybody smiles and gets their coffee, and what do? They go back to their cube or their office and they do what they've been doing,
Yeah.
And, I remember when we had Cheryl Batchelder on years ago, and she talked about, when she was first hired at Popeyes, and she ran into this. Again, trying to overcome the inertia and the systematic, steady plotting in a direction she didn't want to go. Do you remember this conversation? Yeah. She said, for the life of her, she just could not stop the organization from doing what it's organized to do. So her solution, if you'll remember, is she just defunded a whole bunch of departments.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you don't have any budget. So now you can't do what you've always been doing. It was the only way to get this thing turned around. So it's such an important principle. It's happening as we speak in our organization and in every organization, and leaders know every once in a while we've got to ask hard questions about the processes and challenge the process, challenge the status quo. So good reminder.
And Andy, the thing is, when leaders have permission to do this, good things come out of it.
Yeah, in fact, we just did this coming up on a year ago for our entire organization. We just said, hey, we're going to change the diet, not literally, but we're going to take a different approach to everything we're doing here systematically. And it was difficult, and there was pushback, of course. But now, 9 or 10 months into this, we're seeing the results, and it was the right decision. But again, we had to unwind some things that we have been doing for quite some time. And when leaders get this right, everybody wins, ultimately. The organization will remain relevant, and that's why we have to challenge the process where we wake up one day and we're no longer relevant.
Absolutely.
And we end up creating an environment that attracts leaders, because leaders typically resist the status quo, even if the status quo is working. So when we interview people, one of the questions that comes up all the time in interviews here is, hey, you've been doing this for 28 years. I'm 25 years old. How stuck is stuck? I mean, are we open to new ideas? You're gonna teach me the way it's done here. And are you open to questions? Are you open to challenge?
Yeah.
And if they're convinced that yes, from the top down, we're open to challenging the process while we orchestrate our organization and make it predictable enough to where people know what to do when they come to work, you just get better leaders. And then the other thing that happens, if we're willing to keep that conversation a live conversation in terms of challenging the process, nothing goes underground. I mean, one of the things that frustrates us both, and you're welcome to comment on this, is when an executive in our organization leaves, and in their exit interview, they just dump all kind of negative stuff. And you and I look at each other and we're like, why didn't you
They were sitting at the table.
Yeah, exactly. In some cases, they're sitting at the table where these decisions are made.
Right.
And so we work so hard to keep it a live conversation. Is there anything different? And typically with healthy people, it keeps things from going underground because they've had an opportunity to say, hey, what about? Is there a different way? Or here's an organization that's doing this differently. So you just don't want things going underground.
Right.
And it happens anyway sometimes, but we work hard to mitigate against that.
Andy, let's talk for just a minute about the flip side to that, because challenging the process is obviously important, but it has to be done in a way that respects authority or respects the other leaders in the room. How can leaders challenge the process without really challenging their boss's authority?
Well, that begins with the security of the boss, or the leader, or the manager, or the founder, or the franchise owner. And we've talked about this before on the podcast, Lane. And I hope I model this. I think because we've worked together for so long, it's a little bit easier for us, not just with each other, but for other people.
Right.
If I don't invite it, then the people who report to me are going to be less inclined to invite it, and the people who report, and then you have an information problem. It's just not, things aren't going to move up the chain, right? Move up the org chart. So part of it is inviting challenge, being the contrarian. I mean, we've all sat in meetings together where it looked like, hey, we're moving in a direction, and I have felt at times like, no, I need to be the contrarian. This is going too fast. I'm not sure everybody is expressing their opinion. Right. So part of it is just inviting the challenge, appropriately modeling the challenge. But to specifically answer your question, it is important, I think, and this might not be the best word, but if we are, raving fans publicly, it really gives us permission oftentimes to be an honest critic privately. So when the person I report to, or the person in the organization that you report to, whoever it is, as you listen, if your manager or boss knows that publicly you really are a fan, I mean, and not blowing smoke and being disingenuous, but you genuinely respect them and respect their leadership, that gives you the margin and the credibility, and hopefully, if they're secure, the permission to come around privately, not in the meeting, and be an honest critic. So public loyalty actually creates private influence. And I know for me, when somebody says, hey, I need to talk to you about something, and it's negative, my reaction, right or wrong, is often in some ways governed or impacted by their public support, or how I have perceived them in terms of being, and really for me, not so much for me, but for the organization. If I'm convinced this person is for the organization, you know what? Bring it on, because this is what we have in common. We're both for the organization. So, that's part of it. And of course, never verbalize your frustration with the process in front of other team members unless it's been invited, Right. It really is all about maintaining that delicate dance between respect and challenging the status quo. But as leaders, we set the table for that.
Yeah. Andy, I'd say one of the ways I've seen you model this so effectively in meetings especially is when there's someone in the meeting that should be an active participant in the conversation. I mean, something in their world is either at risk or involved, and they're sitting there very quiet and saying nothing. You'll give them a chance to speak, and if they don't, you'll be like, hey, so-and-so, what are you thinking? What's going on? So, I mean, it's that modeling that, giving them permission, drawing them out. And I would say that has given all of our leaders all the way down the line the permission to do that same thing.
Well, I hope that's the case. And in my case, as a founder, and together we're founders, nobody loves this organization more than us. I mean, nobody wants to see it succeed more than us. And so I think that gives us the impetus to be more open to both criticism and suggestion.
Well, let's shift gears a bit, talk about leading from the middle. You had a fantastic conversation on this topic with Adam Grant, where you explored finding common ground through values rather than belief. We're going to listen to a clip from that conversation now.
I think a lot of people are kind of forming, especially now, right, as politically polarized as we are, they're forming their identities based on what they believe is true, when I think, in fact, their identity should be grounded in what they think is important. So the easy example for me is...
Okay, you've got to repeat that, because that's the nut that we all need to crack. That we base our identity not on what we think is true, but what we think is important. Because the moment we do that, we find common ground with even our harshest critics, don't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about who you are, it's about the principles that you stand for, not the views that you hold. Or at least it should be.
Right.
Because that means that you can interact with people that you think you intensely disagree with and discover that you both value freedom or safety or generosity or integrity, but you have different ideas about how to best express and fulfill those values.
Yeah. Values is the common ground. And common grounds where problems are solved and arguments end. So
I think it's the only place that, that we can ever solve a problem. The example that really brings this to life for me is I was thinking about doctors while I was writing the book. And I thought about, okay, if you're a doctor and you base your identity on your opinions, if we rewound the clock a little over half a century, there were a lot of doctors who believed that a lobotomy was a necessary step or an effective step for treating anxiety, for helping people with a range of disorders. And we now know that was a brutal and harmful practice. Well, if you're a doctor and your identity is, I am a professional lobotomist and this is the healthy treatment that I will give, I don't want to see you. I want to strip you of your license.
Right.
The doctor that I trust is the one whose identity is, I learn from the best evidence to care for patients.
Yep. And I value patients. I value the health of my patients.
Exactly. So I'm somebody who protects and promotes health, first do no harm. I'm somebody who's a curious learner, and I'm constantly trying to figure out whether there's something I might have thought was helpful that actually was not. Mm-hmm. And that I would love to see more of us take that on to say, like, the heart of my identity is I am a person who values growth and development, and the only way I can grow and develop is to commit to finding the truth, not believe I've already discovered it.
Andy, the idea of basing our identity on values rather than opinions is a game changer, especially when it comes to fostering understanding and finding common ground with those who disagree with us. Talk more about that.
So common ground is the name of the game for every relationship, right? Even new relationships, but especially those relationships where we want to move someone in a direction, whether we're talking about parents or people we work with or people in our community. But shared values is also where people move us, and all of us need to be moved. One of the things that Adam talks about in his book that we discussed and on the podcast is that one of the best days of our lives are the days we realize we've been wrong about something, because the moment I realize I'm wrong, I'm not wrong anymore. Yeah. So that's a good thing. So the give and take of conversations and relationships, whether it's political conversations, religious conversations, changes in community conversations, all those things that get so heated up so quickly, the rhetoric just escalates to the point where people are yelling and screaming. And again, we watch this. We watch these town halls, or we watch these community gatherings where people just get out of control. The truth is, if you could survey all those people and make a list of what they value the most, the top 5 things would probably be the same, right?
Exactly.
There's so much common ground. So if we can take this into our relationships and take this into our conversations in our organizations, begin with values, and to remember that ultimately our personal identities, and this is why what he said is so important, our personal identities really are built around what we value, not our opinions, even our religious opinions or our political opinions. So it begins with values. So it begins with me recognizing that about myself, which then creates the common ground to begin a conversation with anyone about anything, because there's common ground. And now we're just talking about application. Right. We just view the world differently in terms of what needs to be done or what we need to do in order to further these values. So it is such a big, big deal, especially when we think about what's happening in our country right now, and really all over the world, but especially in our country as we move toward another political season. If we could begin the conversation around values, shape our identity around values, because I think ultimately it is shaped around values, then hey, we can move forward. Shared values allows me to move you, and shared values sets you up to move me. And we all need to move because we're all wrong about something. And our life experience, the way we've been treated, the way we grew up, all of those things creates our worldview. But shared values drags us out of our myopic worldview to understand how the world is for other people. So it's so extraordinarily important.
All right, Andy, on to our final topic in this 15-year celebration. One of the ideas we talk a lot about is that leaders tend to be achievers. I mean, our tagline is to help leaders go further, faster. Now, there's one particular episode that really struck a chord with many of the achievers out there. It was your conversation with Arthur Brooks, where he emphasized the importance of happiness and meaningful relationships over solely pursuing external success. Let's take a listen.
One of the things that's worth keeping in mind, a lot of people, they're not big hippies listening to us, but they have kind of the hippie mantra that if it feels good, do it. That if something you really want something, if you follow your instincts, it must be because that's going to make you happier. That's wrong. Mother Nature only has 2 goals for you and me and everybody listening to us. She wants you to survive and pass on your genes. She does not care if you're happy. Happy is not selected in evolutionary terms. It's just not. Now, if we think about it, for those of us who are people of faith, you've got animal nature and you've got divine nature. If you just do what feels good, you're following your animal nature and you're going to pass on your genes and you're going to survive. Your divine nature is to bring you closer to the source of good in your life, and that's what's going to bring happiness. And that means you're going to have to do a lot of things that don't feel natural. Look, sin feels natural. Sin doesn't feel unnatural. The problem is sin is the most natural thing, right? That's what it means to be fallen. But the point is that we rebel against our nature, and that's what brings us to divinity. That's what brings us to where we're really supposed to be as people. Okay, now back to the whole conundrum. The story that you're talking about, I was talking to this woman my age on Wall Street. She's, I'm in my late 50s and she's in her late 50s and she's killing it, dude. I mean, she's made probably $1 billion. She has a firm named after her. She's doing everything right. Okay, but you talk to her and she says, yeah, are you happy? No. Why not? Well, my husband and I were roommates. I think I have a kind of a cordial relationship with my kids. I'm not making crisp decisions in my firm. I don't like it as much as I used to, but I don't know what else to do. I'm drinking too much. The doctor's giving me bad reports. What do I do, professor? And I'm like, you don't need a Harvard nerd to tell you what to do. You know exactly what to do. You just told me, step back from your firm, take a souvenir in your company, go away with your husband, get back into church, go to Alcoholics Anonymous. Come on, man. What are you doing? Why are you? She says, I know. I say, so why not? And she says, because I always chose to be special rather than happy. Boom, man, mic drop. Because I'm not going to kid you, Andy. Me too. When she said that, it was like a knife to my heart. I can't tell you. I was a CEO before I did this, before I was teaching at Harvard. And I can't tell you the number of nights that I worked the 14th hour as opposed to going for the first hour with my children. And I missed those years. They grew up. Now, I don't have to repeat those errors because in 2 weeks, I'm going to be a grandfather. You probably already are, right?
Just 4 months ago.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And with my adult children, by the way, each one of them spends time with me every day, whether they like it or not. and part of the reason is because I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be happy as opposed to continuing to be special in this particular way. But if you follow your animal nature, if you follow your instincts and your urges, you will always choose special. And if you choose special, you're simply not going to have the happiness that comes. And the happiness comes because of love. Specialness comes because of achievement. Happiness comes because of love.
Lane, I don't even know how to follow up on that. It's so clear and so compelling. And as I shared in that particular podcast episode, that illustration, and that's why we chose that clip of her recognizing I'd rather be special than happy. Goodness, as I shared with our podcast audience, I have told myself that I don't really care about being special. I didn't use that word, but my identity's not wrapped up in what I do. And that was like a breakthrough moment, honestly, for me personally. And I feel like I'm very happy. I don't feel like I've misprioritized. I've written a whole book about choosing to cheat. Cheat your career before you cheat your family. So it's not a sense of regret, but it was an insight. To me, it gave me, and I think other people, words around. We're special at work. I'm just Dad and Andy at home. We're special in certain environments, whether you're a performer, an athlete, or you're killing it in terms of your career. And its specialness is an addiction. As Frank Blake shared when we had him on the podcast, right before he stepped into the role of CEO at Home Depot, I think it was Bernie Marcus told him, hey, Frank, your jokes are about to get funnier. And they're not funny because you're not funny, but you're going to step into this role. And it was just another way of saying you're about to become special because you're the CEO. So everybody's going to treat you special. So again, there's that tension. And can you be special and happy? Of course you can. But at the point where we begin opting for or leaning into what I get because of my career, what I get because of my title or position, to the point that I either begin to neglect or don't enjoy going home or don't enjoy investing in those important relationships, that's a problem. And so I loved this conversation because I think it gave us handles, and it gave us our audience, and it gave me terminology to keep front and center as as we navigate the different seasons of our careers and different seasons of the opportunities that come along. So it was a great conversation.
Absolutely, Andy. And I know as I reach sort of the end of my career, or what feels like, I'm much older than I've ever been, the addictedness to specialness can be awfully hard to walk away from.
Yeah.
So, as you said, it's just something that we all need to pay attention to.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you and I have been here since the beginning, but one day we will walk into these offices and there will be people that don't know who we are.
Right.
And we don't really have a place to go.
Yeah.
In fact, people will look at us. I'm just getting you ready, Lane.
Yeah.
They'll look at us like, what are they doing here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and almost like we don't belong here.
And the ones who know us will be like, I thought you left.
Yeah, I know. We will not, even in our little world, because we're not world famous, but with there's specialness that comes.
Right.
Bob Strickland, who we work with, he worked for Scientific Atlanta for years and years. And when he left Scientific, he'd been there forever and had lots of responsibilities, a big project manager, big company. He said it was amazing how, these are my words, not his. Basically, he said it was amazing how quickly the hole filled in. You think you're important, you think you're special, you think you're critical to success, and 15 minutes later, it's like, we're moving on. Well, knowing that, I think for some of us has the potential to keep us doing things longer than we should do them.
Yeah.
Because the fear of what's it going to feel like on the other side. And for some of us, it can be terrifying. And again, for the 35-year-old out there, they're like, what are you old guys talking about? I'm telling you, this is something that just needs to be out there on the radar.
Right.
Because it's not just maintaining special, it's attempting to achieve special that oftentimes, as we've seen, pulls men and women away from family. And if you're not happy at home, and if you're not happy with your most important relationships, you cannot be happy.
Right.
And you will camouflage your unhappiness with achievement at work where you're special. It just happens all the time. So this lesson applies to everybody.